So, good evening, everybody. It is fantastic to see so many people here tonight as we are gathered to launch the Tribes of a Person-Centered Nation, the third edition, an introduction to the world of person-centered therapies. I think this has been a long time coming. I think it was over 12 years since the last edition. So we're very pleased to have this new edition. And tonight we have got a busy agenda ahead of us. We've got about an hour and a quarter, and we're going to hear from 10 of the chapter authors and also from Mick, the editor. I'm going to keep us to time, and Catherine Jackson, my colleague at PCCS Books, is also going to be the co-chair tonight. We have also an extra special discount, which will be appearing in the chat, which gives you about 30% off the RRP tonight. So if you're interested in getting a copy, it's worth taking a look. And yeah, so thank you, everybody. And it'd be great to see everybody. Keep your cameras on. And I'm going to hand over to Catherine Jackson, who's going to do a bit more of an introduction about the publication. And Mick, thank you.
Hello, hi. Great to see so many people here, as Katie said. When I was preparing for tonight, I read Pete Sanders' reflective biographical notes that he wrote for the second edition, where he described his own relationship with the person-centered approach and the process of producing the first edition back in, I think it was 2004. And even the way that first edition was created reflected the principles of the person-centered community in practice. Pete wrote, "The contributors looked at, commented on each other's work, working to practice the process of dialogue. It took a degree of courage for them to take part in the adventure and submit their work to scrutiny in this way." And he goes on, "I believed then, and this belief is even stronger now, that this is the constructive way forward for us all. It was also a huge treat for me," he wrote. "I learned a huge amount by working with such talented people." And very sadly, Pete didn't live to edit a third edition, and I'm not entirely convinced he wanted to. I think he was tired. But Mick was, I believe, part of that first edition, certainly part of the second, and has been an enthusiastic and energetic advocate for the book in his trainings, encouraging counsellors to trace the roots of their practice and see how Rogers has influenced so much of what counselling profession still offers today. And a bit like Pete, I learned so much from working with Mick and all the contributors to this third edition. I also learned a lot more about Carl Rogers and how central to the development of the person-centered approach was the whole research team that he brought together at the University of Chicago, which is something that tends to be obscured perhaps by the prevailing narrow focus on Rogers' early work on the 6 conditions and his writings. Rogers' team formed a community of individuals pursuing their particular areas of research and development, and they came together to contribute to making the whole. And I feel that it's this coming together of those many facets of person-centered practice today that we see represented here in this new edition of Tribes. The interests of those individuals have grown into the tribes of the person-centered nature. So we've got here Sheila Haugh providing the foundations in the classical person-centered therapy, Gina Di Malta and colleagues on the relational approach, Campbell Purton on focusing-oriented therapy, Robert Elliott on emotion-focused therapy, Richard Doyle and David Murphy on person-centered experiential counselling for depression, and Nicola Blunden on pluralistic person-centered therapy, Annie de la Prida on person-centered creative arts therapy, Dion Van Word on free therapy and contact work, and Dee Ray on child-centered play therapy. Some of those chapters are updates from previous edition. Others, like pluralistic therapy, creative arts therapies, and child-centered play therapy and person-centered experiential counselling, are new additions or developments of brief mentions in the 2012 edition. So I think it's very clear that the person-centered approach continues to flourish and foster the emergence of new tribes within its nation. Now I'm going to hand over without further ado to Mick Cooper, who I know doesn't need much introduction, but I'll just briefly say he is Professor of Counselling Psychology at the University of Roehampton, a practicing counselling psychologist, prolific author and editor of many books and texts. And he is, of course, the editor of the new edition of Tribes. Over to you, Mick.
Thank you, Catherine and Katie. And I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for inviting me to edit this book, and thank you to the contributors and to Online Events, Sebastian and then John and colleagues for hosting this launch. But I mainly wanted to say thanks to Pete and just really take my 5 minutes to say a few words about Pete, who we lost in 2022. I always think about Pete. When I think about Pete, I always remember I have this image of him playing table tennis at our house in Glasgow and just zipping around. I think it was something about his energy when he was just zipping around the tennis table. I was totally surprised. And I think Pete was somebody who was really full of surprises and energy and drive. And I think, like many of us in the person-centered world and also in the wider counselling world and the radical psychiatry world, I really miss Pete. He was a really extraordinary figure, so intelligent, vivacious, warm, passionate. Being brilliant at table tennis was just the start, really, of his superpowers. So it was a real honour to kind of do my best to step into his shoes and edit this third edition of Tribes. And I think it's a testament to Pete's work, creativity and vision that the book's already achieved such a standing in the person-centred field and such a recognition. As Catherine was saying, the first edition was 2004 and then a second in 2012. And it was really the first text to not just comprehensively bring together the main schools of thought, but I think to really talk about the person-centered field in all its diversity and colour and richness, and go into this idea that person-centered was this rich tapestry of different ideas and practices. I remember Pete's excitement, enthusiasm for the book when he first described it back to me in the early 2000s. Pete loved, I think, as everybody knows, the person-centered field. For the values, for its commitment to empowering clients, and also its wider concepts and understanding of social empowerment. And I think for Pete, the Tribes book was a way of sharing his love for the person-centered approach. I think to show both for those of us inside the field and those outside, the richness, the depth and the complexity of the approach, that it was so much more than just a formulae for how you interact or being non-directive is not saying anything, that there was so much more to the field. I think Pete also is somebody who was very loving, very community-oriented, really wanted to bring the person nations closer together. And he wrote in the introduction to the previous edition that our mission is to bring the UK person-centered community into a more intimate relationship with its natural family, some of the other tribes of our nation. And I really hope the book has achieved that and continues to achieve that. In this third edition, we've tried to take that mission forward, really. As Catherine was saying, there's now 11 tribes, up from 5 in the first edition. And then in the second edition, there were 6 with 4, what he called new developments. So we got new chapters on child-centered play therapy, on motivational interviewing, amongst others. And all the other chapters have been extended or thoroughly revised or had new authors come in. There's some other changes. For instance, we've gone back to a more simple referencing system. And one of the things, actually, I'm sure Pete was most enthusiastic about was this idea of having an additional column where all the references. But we talked about that and we thought it's just a little bit complicated and we want to simplify that. And we tried to simplify the chapter structure to make it as readable as possible. Just to finish, I want to quote from the conclusion to our introduction about our dedication to Pete. This book is dedicated to Pete from all the people that loved and learnt from him. Our hope is to continue his work to build a vibrant, diverse, welcoming, person-centered community that can flourish and grow across multiple perspectives and practices. More than that, though, through reflection and learning, dialogue and debate, we hope to build a community that knows itself and that can robustly meet the challenges from the wider field, standing up for a client-directed, non-pathologizing, empowering approach to mental health work. We hope that you find much in the chapters to stimulate and engage you, to make you think and encourage you to take the person-centered vision forward in all its forms. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Catherine for Sheila.
Right, now we'll move on to Sheila Haugh, who's going to be talking about Carl Rogers and person-centered therapy, a historical overview, and the classical person-centered therapy.
Thank you, Catherine, and I've put my timer on. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I've seen some faces I recognise, names, some new names. So, yeah, really nice to not really see you great because we're on so many pages. I'm getting known a bit as the update queen, I think. I did the update on Pete's historical chapter, which he once referred to as his hysterical chapter, and Tony Merry's chapter on classical person-centered therapy, which I tend to call person-centered therapy these days, to be honest. They were both great friends of mine. Knew them a long time. Tony and I were particularly good friends. So it was quite a strange experience. And at the same time brought me back to both of their clear writings and clear understandings of classical person-centered therapy and its history. So I'm not going to say anything about the history. It's there for you to read. I'm someone who does believe knowing our histories of all things is quite a useful position to take sometimes, to know the roots of everything, and talk a little bit more about the paper I updated of Tony's. It's not mega updated. Tony Merry is one of the writers who I consider incredibly easy to read, deceptively easy with the way he deals with the concepts of classical person-centered therapy. And for me, classical person-centered therapy, I'm a bit iffy about the name classical these days. It went through a stage of that being seen as old-fashioned, has never made any changes, didn't develop. And for myself and colleagues I work with, that is very, very far from it. The understandings of what empathy means, I think, are much, much deeper than they were even 10, 15 years ago in person-centered theory practice across the tribes. The exploration, understanding of congruence, and linking that in, I will use the phrase for tonight, classical person-centered therapy in terms of what congruence might mean, I think has been much clearer, stealing a little bit from the person-centered experiential wing in theory making on that. And the notion of UPR, which I think sort of going back in a good way, I think, to the roots of something like, what did UPR mean? UPR meant love, UPR meant respect and compassion. And for all the best reasons and good reasons in the world, we've got a bit technical about these things, and we've got so many acronyms these days. Part of the development for me is, and going back to the roots and taking the richness of the roots and the richness of the soil around the roots, is to reclaim some of that for person-centered therapy and for person-centered classical therapy in particular. Not really sure what else I want to say about it. I think the chapter is really, I would say this, of course, I'm completely biased, having loved Pete and loved Tony and liking my writing a little bit sometimes, is really worth a read for everybody, because I do think if you've got that foundation, whichever way you decide to practice, I mean, I think it's true of all therapies, not just within the person-centered tribes, that the foundations of Rogers' work, with Rogers' work being the foundations, better to say, I think is just incredibly useful. I've really, I mean, I don't like writing, but I love the end result. So I really hope you enjoy the chapters. And that's 1 minute and 5 seconds left, Catherine.
Thank you, Sheila. And I totally agree with you. Read that chapter, because it really does explain an awful lot and puts it in a context that often gets missed. Now we're going to go straight on to Gina Di Malta, who's talking about the relational approach to person-centered therapy. Hiya, Gina.
Hello, hi. First, I want to say it's a real honor to have been a contributor in this book. So thank you so much, Mick. The chapter I'm going to tell you about is the relational approach to person-centered therapy. And so co-written this with Mick and our colleagues, Rosanne, Knox and Steve Cox. Just briefly about the chapter. So it focuses on what it means to be human, but through a relational lens. And through this lens, we revisit Roger's psychological foundations for person-centered therapy. And with this focus on the relational, we encourage a practice that is one of mutuality, reciprocity, and intimacy. In terms of the approach, the emphasis is less on the individual and more is more bidirectional and multidirectional. So we see that there's a shift from looking at the theory from an individual perspective, but more with a relational lens. And we see that Rogers had all of that in his original theory, but because of the context in which the theory was developed, there was more emphasis on the individual at that point, and then it shifted towards the 80s. But we're bringing that out in this chapter, so of the relational approach. And in particular, there was very little emphasis at the start on psychological contact and the client perception of the core conditions. So there's a wealth of research on the core conditions. But in this chapter, we see psychological contact and client perception, which is very much about the bridge between the client and the therapist as what we focus on for the relational approach. In terms of the key practices, really the focus or the essence of this approach is to establish a positive relational encounter with the client. So perhaps what we see is that maybe there are fewer rules to how we do that. And how this can be achieved. And for instance, as an example, there's less emphasis on being non-directive, because from this relational lens, being non-directive also has an influence on the other. So withholding advice would also have an influence or an impact on the client. And with the key practices, so in terms of what the therapist can do, if we go back to the core conditions, I think we take a more expansive definition of what it means to be congruent, empathic, and have unconditional positive regard, in the sense that we have a lot more freedom and creativity in how we can communicate this to the client and how the client can receive that. But there's also, so that's what the therapist can do. So the therapist can be, for instance, more active in being in giving positive regard. So it might take different forms. So you could be praised for certain clients, or it could be different ways. And also the congruence could be, there's a lot more freedom of expression if we don't have to be non-directive necessarily. And then there are other aspects to a relational approach, which are more about the therapist himself and his own self-relationship and how that can be developed. There's also the co-created relationship, which is kind of the outcome of that relationship. So the therapist changes also as a result of that relationship. There are experiences that seem to be shared, like, for instance, with relational depth or experiences of mutuality. And also there's an openness to the world and to difference that is necessary to be able to practice in that way. So I think I've got a bit of time left as well, Catherine. So thank you.
Good heavens, that was brilliant. A brilliant summary of a very thoughtful and deep chapter. So thank you for that. We will whistle on to Campbell Purton, who'll be talking about focusing-oriented therapy. Hiya, Campbell. Oh, you're not.
Okay, sorry.
There you go.
So yeah, so thanks to Mick and the PCCS Books for the chance to do this revised chapter on focusing-oriented therapy. In it, I've tried to show how the place of focusing in person-centered therapy has often been misunderstood, that people have often confused the use of focusing as a self-help method with focusing as a central feature of what used to be called client-centered therapy, or what in the present book is called classical client-centered therapy. I mean, that is, that the form of therapy practiced by Carl Rogers from the 1950s onwards. To some extent, as detailed in this book, Rogers' views on therapy changed over the years, but the essentials of close, active listening, reflecting, and the creation of a safe, non-judgmental space for the client remained the same throughout. I think that an important aspect of Rogers' therapy was that it did not narrow the focus of therapy to such things as rational thinking or emotional expression, or the relationship with the therapist or the client's early experience, that rather it encouraged the client to find their own focus of attention, their own felt sense of what their trouble involved. And in spite of what's often said, Rogers' therapy was in a way directive. It had the effect of gently directing the client towards their own immediate responding, and encouraged them within the safe space of therapy to articulate that responding so as to find their own way forward. But just how the therapist was to help the client articulate their responding was, for Rogers and Gendlin, an open question. Active listening and empathic reflection, what Rogers sometimes called receiving the client, was crucial. But I don't think that either Rogers or Gendlin wanted to set up client-centered therapy as an alternative to other forms of therapy. A few months before his death, in a video-recorded panel, Rogers said, "I didn't want to find a client-centered way. I wanted to find a way to help people." Rogers maintained that so long as the therapist did receive the client, it didn't matter much what techniques they used. And Gendlin wrote, "What matters is to be a human being with another human being. Do not let focusing or reflecting or anything else get in between. There is a sense that we are armed, you see. We have methods, we know focusing, we have credentials, we have doctors. We have all this stuff, and it's so easy for us to sit there with the stuff in between. Do not let it be in between. Put it out of the way." And he added, the client-centered reflecting method is a central thing with which to use everything else. And this, I think, is what is essential to the spirit of the person-centered approach. It could be seen as involving pluralism, as advocated by Mick Cooper and John MacLeod. Although I think that what is most important is not so much having a range of theories and procedures, but an atmosphere of listening and reflection, within which various things may be of help to the client. All sorts of things can help, but the therapist can only know what does help if they keep coming back to how the client is responding. What matters is whether the things that are done help the client to find, articulate, and develop their own responses. Gendlin said explicitly that focusing-oriented therapy is client-centered therapy. Therapists can do all sorts of things, and extensive research in the years since Rogers and Gendlin first wrote strongly suggests that the procedures used in the different schools of therapy are about equally effective. The central idea of focusing-oriented therapy is that what matters most is not what therapists do, but whether they do it in a client-centered way. To repeat Gendlin's words, the client-centered reflecting method is the central thing with which to use everything else. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Campbell, for bringing us back to the very basics and the core. I think that was lovely. Thank you. We move on now to Robert Elliott, who will be presenting on emotion-focused therapy. Hi, Bob.
Hi there, Catherine. Okay, right. Great, wonderful. I just have a couple of slides. It's not really a summary of the chapter. It's more just a couple of slides. I wanted to start by acknowledging and expressing gratitude to Pete Sanders for adding EFT to the second edition of the Tribes book. It's been quite important to me during the time I was living in the UK to be part of the wider person-centered experiential therapy world. And so it felt a great deal of pride to join that august group of tribes. Pete didn't always agree with everything in EFT, although he did come and do a level 1 training with us in Strathclyde while I was there. But I continue to be grateful to his commitment to acting as a critical friend of EFT, even being called names by him. and as well as his openness and spirit of adventure in letting us join this particular party in the person-centered experiential world, right? So I also want to express my gratitude towards Mick and Catherine and Katie and all the good folks at PCCS Books who do so much for the whole approach and for continuing this particular part of the tradition. So thank you very much for that. Part of my gratitude is that I note that for most counseling students in the UK, this chapter in the Tribes book provides their first introduction to emotion-focused therapy. And also I want to express my pleasure in seeing the new tribes and the new faces added to this edition. I now live in California, where we live in a tribal landscape where the Ohlone people used to live here and the Yokuts there and the Miwok there, you know, so this is a tribal landscape and it's lovely to be part of this tribe. So that's introduction. Just a slide quickly on what's new in this version of the EFT chapter. I'm not going to do a summary, but mostly it's been fine-tuning, copy editing, minor updates, including updating the references. The main revisions have been around updating the presentation of EFT emotion theory following the emotion-focused counseling and action book that I published with Les Greenberg in 2021. So there's several sort of things that kind of make the theory more approachable or more kind of clear to people. And one of them is the four-dimensional model of emotion organized around 4 dimensions: emotion categories, emotion scheme elements, emotion regulation, emotion response types, which, by the way, are just a reformulation of the idea of congruence from the person-centered approach. And we also added a relatively recent development, which is the integrated emotional deepening model for how we help clients transform their stuck or blocked emotions by basically going down to the bottom of them and coming back up again. We've also added into this edition pre-therapy contact work as a therapeutic task. We have information on accreditation of EFT therapists, and at the last minute, through Mick's encouragement, Mick asked me, you know, what are you going to say to people who read your chapter, students who read your chapter and now think it would be a really good idea to try out chair work prior to getting more specialized training in EFT. And I created this pre-flight checklist, which says, you know, like, how's, you know, is your empathy there? Have you know, and it's got like 15 different things you should ask yourself. Did you check with your supervisor? And so that was a wonderful little piece that got added that I think is really a nice part of the chapter. It's my favorite part of the chapter now, the pre-flight checklist. So anyway, congratulations and thanks for inviting me. And I will stop there.
Wonderful. Everybody's been very, very good about timing. We're going to spend hours at the end twiddling our thumbs. No, I doubt it. Right. Thank you, Robert. That was a very good introduction and explanation of why people need to read that chapter. And I love the way you spoke about the adventure of it all, because I think we lose sight of the fact that things are supposed to be a bit of an adventure. It all becomes a task. So we move on now quickly to Richard Doyle, who co-wrote with David Murphy the chapter on person-centered experiential counselling for depression. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you and hello. Yes, person-centered experiential counselling for depression is a real mouthful, so I'm going to call it PCE-CFD, or maybe just CFD for short. My name's Richard. Amongst many other things, I am a PCE-CFD tutor at the University of Nottingham. I would like to acknowledge and thank my co-author, David Murphy. Now, in the UK, there was a time when someone could come out of a person-centered diploma or similar training and go and find a job in a GP surgery as a counsellor. That was before around 2006 with the publication of what's called the Depression Report by Lord Layard, followed by the creation in 2008.
Oh, have we lost him?
He got disconnected.
think he might have disconnected. I wonder if we should go on to
You move on to Bill.
and then come back.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll move on to Bill Miller then and come back to him. Bill's going to be talking about motivational interviewing. Hiya, Bill. Are you there?
Hello, yes, I am
Hi.
pleased to be here. I'm new to this book, but not to a person-centered approach. Happily, the first clinical training I got was in a person-centered approach in the early 1970s. And that served the foundation for what became motivational interviewing in the longer run. It developed much as the person-centered approach did by paying close attention to practice and asking what actually does help clients to make positive changes. We're much better at evaluating, measuring outcomes now than was the case when Rogers began his work. And so we can actually tie up therapeutic processes with client outcomes and see what the relationships are. Like Mick's writing about person-centered approach, MI is directional, not directive so much as just having conscious direction to it. An important part of a therapeutic relationship, or at least a working alliance, is having shared goals, having goals that client and therapist agree about. So you know where you're going and have a plan for getting there. And that kind of direction has been a part of motivational interviewing from the beginning, in part because I started in the addiction field where goals are rather clear, that if you haven't helped people to change their substance use, you probably haven't done a great deal for them in that field. It also became clear that what clients say during sessions predicts outcome. And so there's an overlap there with other person-centered work as well, particularly experiencing, that clients' level of experiencing predicts outcomes. And what we've focused on is change talk and its balance with sustained talk, which also predicts outcomes. And it turns out that we, counselors, therapists, interviewers, influence that the amount of that you hear depends a lot on what the therapist is doing. So it's a very relational approach, paying attention to what therapists do and how clients respond and how therapists respond to that, and so on. So it matters. This is something I wasn't taught in my own person-centered training. It matters what you ask, what questions you ask. It matters what you reflect. It matters what you put into summaries and even the order in which you put things into summaries. And so we've done a lot of process research with trying to understand that. How do you put together a person-centered approach to helping people move in the direction that they've asked for help to move in? There is an enormous empirical literature now in motivational interviewing, many thousands of studies. In some nations, person-centered therapists are getting critique for not having an evidence-based approach. Well, there's a huge evidence base to just the motivational interviewing tribe of things here. I keep track of controlled clinical trials, and there are 2,300 of them at this point. So across 70 languages or so. And interestingly, across many professions. This started out in psychotherapy, but like the person-centered approach, spread into many other professions, including education and social work, working with correctional populations. And so it's an approach that's not at all limited to psychotherapy and counseling, but is a way of working with people to try to help them grow and change. So I'm happy to contribute that to the book on tribes and to be part of this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I have to say your case studies that you describe in your chapter are the most beautiful expositions of a person-centered approach. I just found them very, very moving and very powerful. So I recommend everybody to read them, enjoy them too. Now, have we got Richard back yet? Does anybody?
Yeah, he's back.
Hello.
Okay,
so.
can we go back to Richard?
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
My internet's usually very stable, so I don't know what chosen today of all days to pack up, but good to be back. So yes, I was saying that there was a time when somebody could come out of a person-centered training and go and find work in a GP surgery as a counsellor. But after this publication in 2006 of what's called the Depression Report by Lord Layard, followed by the creation in 2008 of the IAPT initiative, that stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, which drew on the NICE guidelines for things like depression and anxiety. I'm using medical language, which recommended CBT as a treatment. And IAPT was implemented in a quite a managerialist, top-down fashion, which severely disrupted the existing therapeutic provision within the NHS at the time, with non-CBT therapists, including many person-centered therapists, finding themselves quite marginalized or even out of work. So there was then a drive to re-establish humanistic person-centered experiential counselling back into the NHS. And when the NICE guidelines for depression were first updated in 2009, there was a decision to include other therapies, including counselling, alongside CBT, recognizing the evidence base that had grown for these therapies. And it was the BACP were commissioned to develop the provision of a therapy for depression. They called on an expert panel of academics and people from BAPCare at the time. And I guess this is maybe one area of controversy within the person-centered world, because in order to proceed, they were required to fit within the IAPT NHS environment with the development of a kind of manualized competence framework, the use of routine outcome measures, GAD-7, PHQ-9, and the use of diagnostic labels such as depression. So it was trying to fit the person-centered approach into quite an alien, in many ways, medical environment with a completely different philosophy, different assumptions about what it means to be a person and the nature of distress and ways of working compared with the person-centered approach. Some describe this as trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And that's never really gone away. Not all, but many PCE therapists who are working in IAPT, which is now called NHS Talking Therapies, feel it's a constant struggle to be working in an environment that's very solution focused, very kind of CBT oriented. There's an agenda to kind of get clients into recovery as defined by the measures used. It's time limited. Sometimes you just have 6 sessions with a client. So it's very pressured. It can be quite stressful. There's a further point, which is that the evidence considered when the NICE guidelines were updated came from studies on what you might call classical person-centered therapy, as well as emotion-focused therapy studies following Robert's talk previously. So the resulting framework reflects the person-centered therapeutic conditions, the kind of 6 necessary and sufficient conditions, and some process facilitation concepts from EFT and focusing, which can be called on sensitively and in response to the client's self-direction, often emerging from the natural flow of therapeutic dialogue to help facilitate emotional processing. In many ways, PCE-CFD has been successful despite its challenges. It's grown in provision, and each year. In 2022, there was 84% of talking therapy services offered PCE-CFD, and I'm sure that's higher now. And on their own measures, it actually has the highest recovery rate, higher than other therapies, all other therapies offered, including CBT. In our chapter, we discuss relevant research, such as the recent large practiced trial, which compared CBT and PCE therapy, published in 2019, the use of the 10-item PCEP scale in training, and we discuss how the phenomenon of what might be described as depression can be conceptualized from a person-centered viewpoint and contrasting that with a more medicalized model. And whilst it remains challenging to be person-centered in the NHS, I think PCE-CFD does provide, it provides paid employment opportunities for PCE therapists, and it does mean that anyone in England can self-refer and receive person-centered experiential therapy free at the point of access. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for dealing with that technical hiccup. Yes, as you say, it does at least mean that people are offered the chance of getting counselling as a potential choice, far more than it would have been otherwise, no question. We now go on to Mick Cooper, who is going to talk to us about his chapter on existentially informed person-centered therapy. Am I right? Yes, I am.
That's right. Thank you, Catherine. So this is one of the chapters that's been fully updated. I have to say, very much improved, mainly because it's now first authored by a colleague of mine, Sibrecht van Huren, who unfortunately can't be here. He's a professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And Sibrecht has really come to be a leading light in the person-centered field and has developed his own experiential existential approach, which combines insights from existential therapy, more classical person-centered therapy, and as well as focusing. So the chapter is based around a case study, and I just wanted to read the start of it to you. The client is called Aisha, and this is a client of Sibrecht's, who was a 23-year-old Belgian student who suffered from depression and bulimia. Aisha could hardly get out of bed. She could not motivate herself to study and would frequently binge eat. She worried about her future and wanted to realize something important in her life in order not to be forgotten. So this was in stark contrast with the fact that she couldn't motivate herself to get things done. Likewise, she hoped to be happily in a relationship at some point, but had a hard time maintaining intimate relationships. Life seemed meaningless to her, and the fact that we all have to die one day made her feel that human efforts were pointless. So the chapter really focuses around Aisha and looks at how existential ideas can add to person-centered theory and practice in a way that can help deepen our understanding and empathy with clients and help engage and move clients in a way that they want to move. And the chapter is very much based around 5 core existential conceptualizations of being and the ways in which they relate to and might add on to classical person-centered approach. So one is about the uniqueness for each individual, which is very much there in the classical approach. Talking also about the connection to others and being in the world, as with Gina talks about in the relational chapter. And then 3 areas that perhaps are less present in the classical approach, although certainly not contradictory. One is about the meaning-orientedness of human beings, the ways from an existential standpoint that we're all searching for meaning. Another about freedom and choice, the way that we are ontologically, which means in our very being, free to choose and have to think about what we do with that freedom. And the last one is about being finite, limited, mortal. So I just wanted to read a bit from the section on meaning, because what Sibrecht and I argue is that an existential approach, as well as addressing personal and kind of individual senses of meaning, also provides a way and a language in which we can think about what life means itself at that more kind of macro level, as well as in individual hopes and purposes. So Sibrecht writes, on a macro dimension, Aisha openly questioned the meaning of life. Not just her life, but life itself. For her, it didn't make any sense. We come out of nothing and then we just disappear again. Aisha openly worried about life's meaning during the first sessions. And during those first sessions, I, which is Sibrecht, will convey my openness towards her ontological questions, like questions of meaning, by just paraphrasing her. And when her experience of life started to shift onto the more personal dimensions later on, I would empathically reflect and re-experience her experiences. When she raised life's meaningless, I would share my sense that there was a lot of loneliness when she talked about these matters, as if she was in a kind of vacuum with nobody around her. So you can see Sibrecht moving from that more individual, personal sense of meaning and questions about meaning to also the more ontological question of what does life really mean? What can it hold? And Sibret goes on to say, instead of tumbling together into the pitfall of having a philosophical conversation, my existential empathy, and one of the things that Sibret writes about in this chapter is about existential empathy, helped her to become more aware of how she experienced life at its core. Existential empathy can be understood as the capacity of the therapist to attune to and resonate with the existential layer of the client's experience, and also to symbolize and communicate this back to the client. Through existential empathy and ontological re-experiencing, I would try to facilitate her meaning-making process about life as such. In this instance, existential empathy goes beyond the concrete situation of the client, which classical person-centered therapy and therapeutic approaches are so good at, and stretch to a caring and empathic understanding of the human condition as a whole. As Rank and Rogers already discussed, for the client, it's precisely the experience of feeling understood in their being and in their more wider questioning that makes existential experiences more tolerable. And even in the case of meaninglessness, the experience of sharing the meaningless more meaningful. So what we do in this chapter is to look at how these kind of existential ideas about meaning, death, freedom can enhance and add to a person-centered approach and make it ever more comprehensive about the ways that we can understand, empathize, and profoundly accept our clients. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mick. You've just gone over by 1 minute. Editor's prerogative. Now we're going to move on to Nicola Blunden, who is going to talk about one of the new approaches, a new tribe, pluralistic person-centered therapy. Hi, Nicola.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, everyone. And I might go over as well. I'll really try not to, because I'm aware of the fairness of not doing that.
I'll be jumping on you.
I'm very thrilled to be part of this book. I loved the last edition. I found it a treasure trove of stuff as a therapist. And I'm really hoping that I'm feeling that the next edition will be that too. And I'm thrilled to be part of that. So the best way to think of pluralism in person-centered counselling is to think of it as a way to approach integration. So it's a model that arose as a response to really pressing concerns of person-centered trainees that were on placement in a course that I was teaching with colleagues. And these trainees, person-centered trainees, they wanted to integrate other things into their practice. Maybe they intuitively felt that the things would be helpful, or there was research evidence, or the client was requesting something. And they wanted to incorporate like a range of cultural resources into their person-centered practice. And that's a wide definition of stuff. It could be knowledge and theories, it could be practices, techniques, and ways of being, and things that just fall outside the person-centered kind of body of theory and practice. So, for example, they wanted to practice trauma-informed therapy, and they wanted to help clients understand the impact of trauma on their bodies and maybe practice grounding techniques, or they wanted to expand into other ways and other settings and working outdoors and things like that, or they wanted to talk about racism with clients that were impacted by racism. And just there's a kind of exponential expansion of knowledge and practice out there that clients were bringing and therapists wanted to bring into the space, but they really struggled with introducing things and doing that within a kind of principled, non-directive, person-centered framework. And they found it really difficult to introduce ideas or to ask questions from their frame of reference, to ask for feedback. And sometimes they were unsure about why their client was in therapy, and they were unsure whether they could ask about that. And sometimes they felt they were withholding information that the client needed. And they really didn't want to break their non-directivity rules and principles. And so we really had to unpack together as a community of learners and tutors and, all of us therapists together about what we meant by non-directivity. Because it isn't a rule book and it isn't a limiting idea, it's a very freeing idea, but it can feel like a rule book. And we felt it was really important that when students, trainees were integrating different things into a person-centered framework, that they were doing that in a way that was agreed between them and the client, and that was agreed explicitly, and that wasn't done to the client, and that non-directivity wasn't assumed, that it was this kind of ongoing reflective process about are we being, me and the client, are we being non-directive here? By which we mean, are we aligning to the client's direction? Are we aligning to the client's organismic valuing process? And how do we know unless we speak to clients about that? And that led us to thinking about a pluralistic approach, which is an approach in which the therapist and the client work really explicitly together to kind of co-design a therapy approach that really fits with the client's direction of travel, and not assuming that, but having lots of conversations with the client about how are we doing this therapy? How are we meeting your needs? How can we fine-tune this? And that becomes a kind of deconstruction process. So rather than coming in with a framework of what we think therapy should look like and doing that to clients, it's involving clients as kind of co-designers of that therapy that can then integrate from a range of cultural resources outside of the person-centered approach. But always doing that with this explicit kind of meta communication. And we're grateful to David Rennie in the person-centered pluralistic community for kind of laying out these principles of meta communication about sharing our intentions and our impacts on each other as a pair. And I think this sits quite well with the chapter that Gina Di Malta was talking about, and the relational kind of bidirectional perspective, because this is about the therapist and the client co-designing, deconstructing and redesigning a unique therapy that kind of really meets the particular needs of this person at this time, but under the explicit direction of the client's organismic valuing process that the therapist is consciously and deliberately aligning to. And so for me, I see that as well as a decolonizing practice, because I think very often as therapists, we have an idea about what we think is helpful, and we think that that's universally helpful, and we kind of present it to the client as a kind of set of givens. And actually that mirrors a colonial mindset that kind of assumes that its truth or its enlightenment is a universal truth. Actually, you know, I think person-centered pluralism is more about being in the territory with the client with a lot of humility, actively and deliberately inviting the client to co-design what does therapy mean to them from the ground up. And I don't see that as actually contradicting person-centered values at all. And in fact, I see that as aligned quite closely to what maybe Sheila would put in scare quotes as a classical position. I don't want to speak for you, Sheila, but I heard what you said about maybe not using that term. But actually, I think for me, that is a very client-centered position. Not every practitioner would agree with me with that, but either way, what the chapter offers is a way to think about integration within person-centered therapy with a lot of specific examples about how you use meta-communication and co-design to kind of create a therapy with the client, and aligning to their process along the way.
I'm to wrap. Are you done? Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Oh, God, I was so fascinated. I forgot to look at the clock, to be honest. I've just woken up. Okay, thank you, Nicola. That was a very clear description of the mapping of the two. We're moving on now, slightly late. We're to Annie de la Prida, who's talking about another new entry, I think, to the tribes, person-centered creative arts therapies. Hi, Annie, welcome.
Hi. So just tell me what time you want me to end at. So 58, what's that? 3 minutes past?
Yep, about then.
I will do my best. So I've been sitting here getting increasingly nervous because I haven't prepared anything, no slides, or even thought about what I'm going to say. But first I wanted to just really thank Mick for inviting me to contribute to this amazing, amazing book. I am so thrilled to have had the opportunity. And I also want to thank Liesl Silverstone and Natalie Rogers, and also Laurie Rappaport, whose work I really wanted, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to build on. And also Pete Sanders, because about 10 years ago, I invited Pete to talk to some of my students. And afterwards, I invited him to my house and I cooked for him, and we had a wonderful time, and he was fun, and we had an intense conversation, because I took him to task a little bit on why the creative arts chapter wasn't a fully fledged tribe. Why wasn't it? What was different about it? And we had quite a heated conversation, at the end of which he said, "You seem to have a lot to say on this, Annie. Why don't you write?" So he planted the seeds, and it's taken me a very long time to develop, I think, the courage and confidence really to do this. I trained in this approach 24 years ago as a child, and it was instantly, I was passionate about it. And after that, I trained as a talking counsellor and psychotherapist in order to work with this approach. And it had just always seemed to me, if we only work with talking, we're not inviting all of the client into the therapeutic engagement. And the actualizing tendency and creativity are intertwined. So working with the creative arts approach, and that includes any form of creativity, simply invites the actualizing tendency more directly into the session. And when you do that and you have specific skills that were developed by Liesl and Natalie, actually magical things happen. And I think sometimes people get a bit nervous about words like magic. So having the opportunity to explain magic as therapeutic transformation and underpin it with theory to help explain how it isn't directive has just been such a wonderful opportunity. And I really hope that with this chapter, it helps to inspire people to be brave with creativity and to understand it, and also to understand how to work safely, and that there are some key skills and understandings to work with what is an incredibly powerful approach, and also to maybe inform, because the creative arts approaches have been very excluded. We're excluded from the art therapy world and criticised. And within the person-centred world, it has felt as though we're excluded and misunderstood as either something light and fluffy or directive, when actually it's not. It's an incredibly powerful way to work with the client that is incredibly gentle at the same time, and that's what makes it so magically effective and meaningful. And I think it was also really, for me, the opportunity to think about and develop my own thinking and ideas to build on this. It really was a bit of a moment when it dawned on me, when I was thinking about these approaches and how do I explain how they all fit together and bring them into today's world, into contemporary practice. And it dawned on me, of course, they're all pluralistic in essence, and they always have been. And once I realised that, all of it started to make more sense. And I hope that that is what you will get from reading the chapter, is an understanding of the collaborative nature and how working creatively is a container and an invitation rather than a direction. Anyway, I think I'm bang on time, so I'm a bit pleased with myself there. If you want to join me, if you've got any questions, I've popped a link in the chat. I'll open my own room and you can come and have a chat with me there or ask me any questions. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Annie. That was a very inspiring for your chapter, I think. We're now moving on to pre-therapy and contact work with Dion van Werder. Are you there, Dion?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello there. Did I pronounce your name wrong? Probably. I apologize.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
So good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to write. I really enjoyed it, put a lot of work in it and got some support. First, I want to say something about the authors of the chapter. It's Pete and myself, and that has two good reasons. First, to include Pete is a kind of dedicating this chapter to him, because he was a close friend. He was a member of the Pre-Therapy International Network, was at our yearly meetings in Belgium, and so on, saw him at conferences. So there was a really narrow friendship with him. And the second, the chapter in the third edition is an extension of the chapter that he wrote, not the chapter, he wrote on pre-therapy as a new development, 9 pages, and I extended it to the 26 pages it has today. So I found it, as well as a dedication, as well as a recognition of his writing, apt to have these 2 authors for this contribution. So it's now a standalone chapter, and I hope that it does what it's supposed to do, and that is introducing pre-therapy and trying to give you an idea how it looks like in practice. And that's quite a challenge, because writing on pre-therapy is if you describe cases, it looks wooden and sometimes even stupid with just repeating and stuff. So I tried to put a little bit flesh on the bones, so that you have an idea what it's really about. You know, the sensitivity. The word existential empathy was used, and I think there's a lot of existential empathy in pre-therapy. So I hope this comes across. What's special in this text, and that's maybe a good reason to read it also when you already read other texts on pre-therapy, is that in this contribution, 2 examples are there, 2 small cases of pre-therapy in an everyday situation. So it's not about heavy psychiatry or residential stuff or whatever. It are 2 everyday situations. One is somebody who goes into a catatonic state when being interviewed in an occupational rehabilitation center, where I used to work. You know, I live in Germany now, and I worked in another program, but this person was interviewed and went into a catatonic state, was in there for 5 hours, and after 5 hours they came to get me because they knew this guy is busy with something, you know, not really understanding. But I went in and I did pre-therapy for 2 hours, and in the end the person by his own force, and that's important, was able to stand up and go home, you know. So that's one case. And the other case out of an everyday situation is about a man in a group therapy, a bodily oriented psychotherapy group, and it's a debrief during a debriefing of a group exercise, and this man goes into he dissociates. And in that group happened to be a pre-therapist as a participant, and he used pre-therapy to get this man back into connection with himself, with the environment, and able to communicate. It's quite particular because the 2 therapists who run the group didn't know how to handle it, neither did other people in the group knew how to handle it, and the tension rose. And by the help of this man using very simple pre-therapy so-called techniques, pre-therapy reflections, was able to invite this man, welcome this man, getting him back into connection, as said, with himself, with the world, and with others. So that are 2 examples of what I called an everyday situation. And what is also particular in this contribution is that in the second example, there is a report of the client of the person who received pre-therapy. So you have an insight of how this pre-therapy came across and what it did. So how he went into dissociation and how he went out. So has never been written about before in person-centered literature. So to end, thanks again. Congratulations on the project. I had a lot of respect. It's a huge amount of work. I can't even imagine, but I know it's huge. So thank you again. And for the other people, enjoy reading the book and hopefully enjoy reading our chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dion. And I think a special thanks, because I know that Pete was particularly keen on pre-therapy and contact work. So the fact that you were there and able to pick up the short chapter and extend it is just wonderful. So thank you. So we move on to our very final contributor, who is Dee Ray, who will be talking about child-centered play therapy, which is another new addition, I think. Hi, Dee.
Hi. Wow, I'm the last. I have to be entertaining, right? So I'm happy to be here. When Mick emailed me, I think part of the email, the initial email was something about, are you familiar with the Tribes book? And I looked to the left of my office desk, and there were editions 1 and 2. I had read both. They are Bibles to me on the person-centered approach. So I was incredibly honored to be asked to participate in this. And also, you know, a little bit like, why hasn't child-centered been recognized before by the person-centered tribes? Child-centered play therapy does go along the idea of classical person-centered, that it is non-directive in nature, definitely the belief in the self-actualizing propensity of children, and how do we provide the environment to unleash that. And so this is a very unusual thing for a lot of adults when it comes to children. In fact, one of my favorite stories, I didn't know Carl Rogers, but I remember being very disappointed in finding out his first book, the title of it was The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, which does not sound very person-centered to me. So I read that book and was like, oh my goodness, what is this? So fortunately, you know, it's nice when people come along and you have somebody brilliant like Carl Rogers, and then not quite knowing how to translate what you do in person-centered to children. And so his relationship with Virginia Axline changed that for everybody. So Virginia Axline did figure that out. And then how do we take this approach and offer it to children? And that's the history of child-centered. And so the chapter that I wrote gives a little bit of that, but really goes into what is child-centered play therapy? How does it, how do the 6 conditions manifest in working with children? Because it's really hard sometimes to think about, oh, I'm not going to be guiding a child. I'm not going to be telling a child what to do, because culturally, that is how adults mostly look at children, is they need guidance, they need to be controlled, their impulses need to be controlled, all of those kind of things. So this idea that you can trust a 5-year-old in a permissive environment, that you can trust that 5-year-old, and that they will work toward the betterment of themselves and others is a relatively unique perspective for most adults. So it was great to be able to talk about that in the chapter. One of the things that's a little bit more controversial, I think, in the child-centered play therapy world is around that we do have a protocol. I wrote the protocol for it. And it was not something that I was really wanting to do, but what was happening in the US is through the evidence-based movement, and that child-centered was being left out, that it was not being funded, it would not be recognized by insurance companies. It was not, the government wouldn't give grant funding for it. And it was because of this idea of, oh, there's no manual, there's no protocol. So that was something that I contributed, that I talk about in the chapter, but really it's using the work of Virginia Axline, Gary Landreth, the people that have come before me, on what constitutes child-centered, what constitutes child-centered play therapy is the relationship. We do have phrases in child-centered play therapy, which is that the toys are their words and play is their language. But ultimately the change agent is the relationship between therapist and child. So the toys serve as a dictionary. We're just making sure that the children have the words that they need to express themselves in a self-directed way, and that we provide that environment for them to work toward what they know intrinsically will better them and will better their relationships with others. And so in looking at that, a lot of people, when they think of child-centered play therapy, they think of, oh, what activities are you doing? How is the play being structured for the child? The child structures it in child-centered play therapy, and we can trust them. And one of the really exciting things about that is that we have a multitude of research to support the child-centered way of working. It is recognized in the US, and it is recognized in some form or another in many other countries, including the UK. because of the amount of research that has gone behind it that supports the reduction of symptoms, the improvement of relationships that children experience, the academic achievement that is achieved. That's another great finding that comes out of child-centered, is this progress in academic progress and success in school based on when a child is feeling better about themselves, and we can trust them to move toward that. And I could just talk all day long, but I know everybody's tired, so I'm going to stop. So thank you. It's very exciting.
Thank you, Dee. Yet again, there's just a splendid case study in her chapter that illustrates it very, very beautifully, and I really encourage people to read it. So everybody's been fantastic, and we've more or less kept to time, but we are at the end now. Is there a moment for, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Katie and possibly to Mick to decide if we do a wrap now or pick one question from, because there's a lot of very active conversation in chat.
I think maybe we go for one question and then we call it a wrap. Mick, did anything jump out at you in the chat?
There was some questions about there was a question about pluralism. There's some questions about the relationship with Scoped. But I think as we're coming up to time, it might be best to bring things to a close. They're quite specific questions, and I've seen that there's been some responses to them. So I think the main thing would be to just say thank you so much to everybody and for all the contributors who's come along and presented their work. I'm sure people have got a sense of the wonderful melting pot of ideas and practices. And as Dee was saying, she could talk forever. There's so much here. There's so much richness to process. And I really hope people will have a look at the book. If you haven't had a look at it already, it's really, it was really exciting editing it. And I think bringing just so much difference and diversity within the approach together and really helping to move the approach forward. So Katie, back to you and Catherine. But thank you so much for everyone for coming along for this session and for the book launch.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for everybody that's joined us tonight. That's fantastic. But mostly I want to say thank you so much to all the contributors, Mick, and all the chapter authors, and for giving your time tonight and keeping to time tonight as well. It has been such a rich array of individual talks, and thank you. I think I'm quite moved by the fact that this has all come together, and to thank you for Mick for bringing it together as well. And also, just as an aside, I think we broke the website tonight for those that were trying to get the book. We'll make sure that that's back on track ASAP. So thanks again, and I wish you all a good evening. Thank you.